Thank you so much for joining us for Music Unveiled. We're delighted to be back here in Galway City Library, one of our favourite places to visit. Music Unveiled is our guided listening series where we break down some of the repertoire that we perform at our concerts. It gives you a chance to have a little deep dive. Less stress, more success is the feeling that we're going for. So we hope that you get loads out of this and then join us at our Lunchtime concert next Tuesday in St Nicholas Collegiate Church at 1:10 to hear the works in full plus more. So we have two speakers today. Dr. Amanda Feery from the University of Galway and Dr. Aidan Thomson from the University of Galway. So we're really lucky to have both of these wonderful academics with us. But Amanda is also a composer, so she'll be talking about her piece as well. Perfect for this time of year because it's all about the winter solstice. So I'll let her tell you more about that. Before I do, a thank you to our funders, the Arts Council of Ireland, the University of Galway and Galway City Council for making this possible and free, of course. I'm going to invite Caroline Rowan now from the library to speak to you for a couple of minutes and then we'll get underway.
Well, you're all very welcome this morning to Galway City Library. I suppose Maeve has obviously done a wonderful introduction for everyone who's coming. I'm just going to mention that Galway Public Libraries are absolutely delighted to be partnered with Music Connects for this. It's a huge opportunity to be able to bring music into libraries and to share the knowledge and the experience of music in a very different way, because typically we tend to think of music as taking place in concert halls or in street performances. So inside the library, it's a different setting. It's a quiet space typically, so it's nice for us to have a little bit of music here. It's also an opportunity for you to experience the library in a different way. So hopefully, after the learning that you get from this and the music that you enjoy, you'll take the opportunity to access some of our resources. We actually have a resource called Medici TV, which allows you to stream classical music, opera and ballet for free with your library card. So if you enjoy this morning, you can take that opportunity to expand your experience of music. And we would very much encourage you to do that. Libraries aren't just about learning and reading from books. We're about experiencing every part of culture. So please enjoy the session, and I'm delighted you can be here with us this morning. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce Dr. Amanda Feery now, who's going to speak about her piece that she's arranged specially today for a string trio, but I'll let her talk to you about that.
So the piece is called Sun Stands Still, and it very much connects with winter solstice. So this diagram here is our months of the year. It shows our solstices and equinoxes, and it also kind of superimposed on top of that as well is the Celtic festival. So we're kind of in Samhain, but there's Luna there and Bealtaine and Imbolc. And the starting ideas for this piece came from a very visual place, specifically winter sunlight, and more specifically, winter sunlight on sunrise at winter solstice through the monument Newgrange. So for the last few years, the Office of Public Works have been live streaming this at sunrise on winter solstice, so we can all view the light that comes through the chamber. I've not been lucky to win the Newgrange lottery and be in there in the chamber, but it's really nice that it's live streamed now, and I try to tune in every year. But this was like the starting point for the material. The rays of sunlight that very kind of slowly, gradually fill up the chamber. And I was trying to think of sounds and sound colours that connect to what would musically reflect the sort of sunlight and rays of winter light that come through. So that was kind of my starting point for the piece. And we might start with excerpt 1. So that's really the starting material where it's sort of calm and placid and reflective. you can hear there the material is quiet. It's almost kind of frail and brittle. And I think that's sort of to reflect the winter sunlight. You know, summer sunlight, the sun is as high in the sky as it can be. There's such brightness to our surroundings, but the way winter sunlight, the angle of the earth, it's a little, it's quite different in terms of the shadows that are cast. So this is the kind of material I started out with to sort of kind of mimic that visual of the sunrise going through Newgrange. But it got me thinking about material that's in conflict with this excerpt, and I started thinking about winter and how we spend that winter period, what nature is telling us, and we can really learn a lot from our ancestors. Just going back to the sort of Celtic wheel there at the previous slide around Samhain and how our ancestors spent that time. It was a time to sort of hibernate and reflect and replenish ourselves. So nature really wants us to be like this and cozy and just spending time indoors and resting. But this is where there's sort of conflicting material that enters into the material piece as well, because the reality is very, very different, and it's more like this, and we're like caught in the cold and traffic, and the world is telling us to do the opposite, where we have to be really busy during this season, but we're less and less kind of communing with like what nature message is and what nature is telling us to do. So this is where very contrasting material comes into the piece, and the piece and how it unfolds, it's always trying to get back to that kind of more frail, reflective, more placid material, but it's almost like it's interrupted or kind of infested with this contrasting material then. So maybe we can listen to excerpt 2 then, where we start with that sort of calmer material, but it goes in a different direction then. Thank you. So I really love writing for strings, and I love writing for voices as well. And I think that's because there's so much nuance that's possible in both voices and strings. And to evoke this kind of conflict in the piece between the sort of calmer, reflective material and the material that doesn't want to go in that direction and go the opposite direction, there's a lot you can kind of do with strings. And I've only mentioned a few here, but there's a lot more that we can kind of discuss with string players. One being bow pressure. Is a light pressure of the bow against the string, or a heavier kind of pressure? Where on the string the bow is placed? What string? Is it high or low? Is the material played with vibrato, so the string vibrating, or is it not played vibrato? And you can get so many nuances and differences by specifying different things, basically. So maybe we could play verse 47 and 48, but this time just without the sul ponticello, and maybe just without vibrato and quiet and still. So in the notation, what I've specified is something quite different. So the players are basically, the bow is placed in a different point on the string, and you get a sort of like, is gritty the best word to kind of describe? You do get a grittier kind of sort of texture that comes into the sound. So maybe we can play it as written now. Yeah, so there's like differences that depending on how heavy or light the bowed played against the string and where on the string, you can evoke those kind of different contrasting material, I think, between calm and reflective and something else, something kind of darker, I suppose. So maybe we'll look at the next excerpt then, where again, the piece is always trying to get back to the opening material. And here it just goes further into that more contrasting material then as the phrase progresses. Great, thank you. So I didn't really set out to have a specific kind of form for this piece, but if I was to compare it to anything, it would be as the piece and material unfolds, it's almost like a meditation session. If anyone is familiar with meditation, or even just sitting there, sort of like trying to rest or calm your thoughts. So because the structure of the piece, the material is always trying to get back to that more reflective place. And this is kind of how a meditation session unfolds as well, is that these thoughts keep coming in, and the active meditation is to quell the sort of busyness and activity of those thoughts. So the structure is the same. It's constantly trying to get back there to that calmer spot or place. But as the material unfolds, then it kind of gets into a slightly more chaotic area. So the next excerpt then we'll play is excerpt 4. So this it's kind of each time the intensity, I suppose, ramps up a little bit. Good, thank you. The final section of the piece is, I suppose, a kind of a reckoning where it's the both material is superimposed on top of each other. So you'll hear in the viola part, just jump to the viola part in the middle here, sort of references the opening reflective material, but there's something in violin 1 that not is all quite right. So you'll hear an effect called tremolo in the violin, which is kind of like a shivering, shaking effect. So that's going on in the background while the material is sort of trying to settle itself a little bit. So it never fully gets back to the opening material that's in a more calmer place. So they're sort of meeting in the middle somewhere to close out the piece where the material is sort of layered on top of each other then. So this excerpt 5.
When the cello is playing below the bridge,
Yeah.
is that tuned in any particular way, or is it tunable even?
It cannot be even if you want. Yeah, I mean, ideally, I mean, like going back to the tradition 300 years ago, where they say that a perfect instrument to recognize when you play above the bridge, it will sound a fifth higher on each string, but behind the bridge. So. But this is kind of a fourth, not a fifth, because it's a perfect fifth. But a fourth, it's also a perfect fourth. So yeah, it's close, but not necessarily depending on the acoustic of the venue, or this can change, or depending on the strings. You know, you use gut strings or metal strings or a kind of mixture. So, but ideally, it's like a fifth above, yeah. And it's not, it's rarely performed, yeah.
Thank you.
I wouldn't have known the exact pitch, so it was more like the sound colour really that I was going for, that kind of frail sort of sound rather than the specific pitch or tone.
And it's good to know that usually when you play a string instrument, the string vibrates from the bridge, obviously after the beginning, until and obviously when you play here, the string vibrates it's just a tiny bit, it's very short, so then you get a kind of more airy, icy kind of sound. So it's more about the color than the real pitch, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
How did you realize that like these sounds can like invoke that feeling, and how did you get like the inspiration for this piece and everything?
I think a lot of my pieces come from a really specific visual idea, and then I sometimes sit down at the piano, but it's kind of different with strings, so I'll often just sing different tones, maybe 2 or 3 tones together. So I have a lot of like WhatsApp voice notes that I don't want anyone ever hearing. That are just me humming away or singing away, because when it's different at the piano for sketching out certain ideas, but with strings, because it's a continuous sound, I often prefer to sing, so I can kind of hold or sustain the notes. So it's really that, and I suppose sometimes I'll write just prose, write notes to myself about what kind of different sound colours might reflect that kind of sunlight. Looking at pictures is maybe a way of procrastinating, but it's helpful, or just looking at a particular painting or visual, and then thinking how that might be reflected in different musical elements like the pitch, the timbre, the rhythm. Rhythmically with that material, it's very sparse, isn't it? It's just very still and very sustained. So I might write notes to myself sometimes, but often I'll just start improvising and recording. Thanks. Any other question? Okay, well, thank you so much to ConTempo. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing the full piece. Thank you.
You might have heard Amanda mention the word wintering during her talk, and that is because our theme for the month of December is wintering, and we're trying to offer people a chance to slow down through music, because as Amanda says, we're built to slow down at this time of year, but society says otherwise. So each month this year, we've been looking at a different, theme through the broader theme of nature and ecology. So we've been looking at everything from trees to birds to water throughout the year. But we wanted in December to look at hibernation, reflection, stillness, and in a way giving us all a chance to imitate what nature is doing at this time. And so we have curated a program to, I suppose, give you that feeling through music. And one of the pieces is this wonderful movement of one of Mozart's Divertimento for a string trio. So we're jumping about 300 years back from Amanda. Unfortunately, we don't have Mozart here in person. But in his place, we do have Dr. Aidan Thomson, who's a senior lecturer of music in the University of Galway, who's going to break it down for us with the help of ConTempo Quartet. I'm going to hand you over now to Dr. Aidan Thomson. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maeve, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about this piece. It's one that I have to confess, know before this talk, and it's one that just really bowled me over, and I hope it will have that effect with you as well. Divertimento in E-flat major for string trio, and just a little bit about the background of this piece. First of all, the string trio, as you'll be aware by now, is for violin, viola and cello. It's not a combination that Mozart actually uses very much at all. There isn't a string trio among any of his published works. There's a few string trios that have been attributed to him, but that's not quite the same thing, and there's some doubt as to whether or not they are by him. So this is very much an exception. It's a work that is called a Divertimento di 6 pezzi, a divertimento of 6 pieces, and you're probably thinking, well, what is a divertimento in the first place? It's a chamber piece. It's usually a chamber piece that is relatively light in terms of tone. It's a work that is often associated with entertainment of some kind. The number of movements can vary, and Mozart wrote a number of them early in his career, some of which I remember as a student busking or playing at weddings and so on. That's the 136, 137, 138 ones that you will know well, I'm sure, which are like kind of small-scale string quartets, but perhaps a little bit more light-hearted. This is actually cut from quite a different cloth, this particular piece. The fact we've got 6 movements to start with, the length of the piece is something in excess of 40 minutes, 40 minutes in other words, which is long for divertimento. A typical divertimento is probably not going to be more than maybe about 10 to 15. So it gives you an idea that this is a much weightier work. It's written relatively late in Mozart's career. It was written in 1788 in Vienna. It was premiered in Dresden the following year. And it was written around the same time as Mozart wrote his last 3 symphonies, all of which are fairly monumental works. It's written between Don Giovanni and Così fan tutti in terms of his later operas. It's also written not long after Mozart had finally got himself a job at the imperial court, which is something he'd been trying to get for years. And it's also a work that was written after Mozart had become quite heavily involved in the Freemasons movement. And in fact, the dedicatee of this the Divertimento is this chap on the right, Michael von Puchberg, who was a merchant, a Masonic friend of Mozart's, who lent him lots of money, which on reflection was probably a bad thing to do, because Mozart was notorious for not paying his creditors and getting very badly into debt. I don't think that's the reason that Puchberg later in his career became bankrupt, but become bankrupt he did. So maybe it was a contributory factor. But one other thing to note is this piece is an E-flat major, and E-flat major has got 3 flats in it. And these 3 flats in Mozart's music often have an association with the Masonic movement. And Magic Flute, his last opera, which is often associated with, seen as a metaphor for aspects of Freemasonry, also has a strong E-flat major connection. And there's various other works that come into that category as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should be thinking of it as just being a Freemason's work. but certainly the fact it's dedicated to von Puchberg might suggest something along those lines. There are 6 movements altogether, and we're going to be listening to the second of these, or parts of the second of these, which is an Adagio. First movement, last movement. In many ways, it's actually quite like a typical string quartet. A typical string quartet or string trio would have 4 movements, a fast opening movement, a slow movement, a minuetto, which is a dance, and then a finale, which again is fast. Now here Mozart also has an andante, a moderate tempo that is a theme of variations, and then a second minuetto as well. So this is why it's a more expansive work than perhaps a typical string trio might be. So I'm going to be talking about the second movement. The second movement is loosely based on sonata form, and I won't go into all the ramifications of sonata form just now, but the gist of sonata form is there are 3 parts to it. An opening exposition where we hear at least 2 and usually 3 different melodies. The first melody is in the home key of the movement. Then we change key for the second theme, and then there's a closing section of some kind. So that's how the exposition works. In this slow movement, Mozart actually has changed from E flat major to A flat major. The A flat major is our home key for the second movement. The first theme is in A flat major. We then change key in a transition section to E flat. We have a second theme in E flat major and a short closing section in E flat major as well. Then Mozart developed some of the themes in the sonata form movement. The development can sometimes be quite extensive. In this movement, not so much. And then we have a recapitulation, which is basically the same as the exposition in terms of material, except this time we don't change key. So the whole thing here is an A flat major. And there's also a short coda as well. So I'm going to just take you through little bits of this piece and explain what's going on. And I suppose if we're looking for a theme of today, a kind of broad conceptual theme, it's the idea of expansiveness. And this, I think, does tie in with the idea of wintering, and particularly indeed the idea of what Amanda was talking about earlier. This idea that we need to take time to stop rushing around, and instead just to take a view of our surroundings. And this idea of expansiveness of time, expansiveness of space, I think is an important aspect of the wintering theme. And it's something I'm going to hear in the music as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, I'm just going to talk about the primary theme, the first theme of this, this section. I'm not going to ask you guys to play it immediately, but instead, before you play anything at all, I just want to explain how themes are put together in this era. A typical classical theme is going to be 8 bars long. So something like dum bum 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 ba dum ba da dum ba dum. That would be a kind of typical sort of theme. Now this one is slightly longer than that. There's an extra 4 bars to it, as we'll hear. But Mozart actually takes it even beyond that. So what I'm going to ask you to do, what I'm going to ask our players here to do, is to play what the theme really ought to be if it were just 12 bars long. And then I'm going to show you how Mozart expands it. So do you want to play bars 1 to 11 plus the first note of bar 18? You can already work out how much he's expanded it by now. Now that's what the theme ought to be if it were an ordinary theme, but that's not what Mozart does. He actually extends it. And what I'm going to ask the trio to do now is to play the last 4 bars of what we just heard and then continue with what Mozart does, because what he does, just at the point that we stopped, instead of coming to a nice full close, a nice sense that we've finished the phrase off with what we call a cadence, a perfect authentic cadence, we have a different type of cadence, what is called a deceptive or perhaps an interrupted cadence. And this is instead of finishing up in the chord that we finished up with, we finish up in another harmony. And this gives Mozart the excuse then to extend the previous few bars that we've just heard. There's a bit of repetition, there's a bit of imitation between the violin and the cello. So can we go from bar 9 and you'll hear what Mozart does. And I'll point out this deceptive cadence when we get to it. Here it is. Hear how it's different? So he has to continue it. Okay, thank you. You see what he's done there? He's taken what would have been a fairly ordinary end to a phrase, and he's taken us in a different direction and just expanded it all, just giving us a chance to hear what Bogdan had been playing at the start of that excerpt. Again, passing it to Adrian, and there's a bit of dialogue between them. We have a slightly more elaborate end to the phrase. It just gives this sense of space, I think, extra time, and a sense, it's the equivalent of, if we're thinking of Newgrange again, of standing and suddenly looking around at our surroundings and seeing the whole valley before us. Okay, well, let's move on from the passage that we've just got to. This is the passage that we are going to be listening to next, the transition. This is where we change key, I'll ask you, if you can just play the whole of this section from bar 18 to bar 25. Okay, and just to explain that this whole section is loosely based on material that we've already heard. Could you maybe play bars 9 and 10, and then we'll play bars 18 to 20, and you'll hear how what we've already heard is basically being developed further. Okay. And then from bars 18 to 20. So da 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 has become da 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 da. It's basically the same idea. So again, Mozart is expanding. He's taking the idea, or perhaps extending. He's taking the idea and finding a new way of presenting it, a new way just to reinforce where we've got to. Okay, we can move on now to our secondary theme. And what's striking about our secondary theme is that it actually begins the same way as our primary theme. If you remember back to the very beginning, we had da 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 from the cello and long notes from the violin and viola. What we're going to have now in this melody is the violin is going to go do 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 with the other two instruments holding the long notes. So it's the same idea to start with, But then Mozart goes off in quite a different direction. And again, the core theme ought to be 12 bars long. So I want you to play, guys, if you can play from bars 26 to 38, and then when you get to 38, Adrian, if you can play a low E flat instead of a C. Now, sudden change. And that again is what the phrase ought to be. However, again, Mozart gives us one of these deceptive cadences, which means that the phrase doesn't end at that point, but is expanded again. And he finds ways to continue this sense of expansion for several bars afterwards. Could we go from 35 and which is the last 4 bars of what you've just heard, and then continue through to the double bar? Here's the deceptive cadence. And again, it doesn't feel over, does it? Again, we think this is the end of the phrase, and it isn't. And this time it is. So we finally get there, but Mozart is constantly holding back and holding back and holding back before we finally get this melody to an end. And it's such a beautiful melody. It's this lovely long-breathed melody where he suddenly seems to develop an extra set of lungs and keep it going for an even longer breath by holding it back. So this sense of expansiveness. And this, what we have, I suppose, here is we've got the same starting point for each of these melodies, but they head in quite different directions. When we have our original theme, it's what we would call the singing style in the classical era when Mozart was part. That melody would be called a singing style melody because it's one you could imagine a singer being able to sing. It's a very vocal sort of melody, and there's nice dialogue between the instruments that we heard, which is part and parcel of what chamber music's about. But then the secondary theme is quite different in style. You'd have heard Bogdan's big leaps, the da, ba, da, ba. Big leaps, and Andrea and Adrian accompanying with the cha, 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 much heavier kind of accompaniment. So this secondary theme is carried much more by the violin. It's much more a violin with an accompaniment rather than a dialogue between instruments. And these big leaps and the harmony beneath it all is quite angsty. There's a real sense of pain and suffering that we're getting here. Not in a very tragic way because it resolves quite quickly, but in perhaps a slightly sentimental way. And this is an example of what in the classical era would have been called the sentimental style, or to use the rather wonderful German word for it, Empfindsamkeit. So we've got two different characters going on. We've got a singing style, which is very kind of clubbable and conversational, and then we've got this much more angsty Empfindsamkeit going on. So, and all of this starting from the same basic musical idea. So I'll just now play you, if we may, the development, which is the section that follows. And what Mozart does here, it's quite a short section, is to take the opening dum bom 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 bom, and pass it from instrument to instrument, and it continues this angsty sensation that we're in. We go into a minor key, and the harmony uses a chord called the diminished seventh, which is the sort of chord you would get in a lot of old black and white Hammer House of Horror films. It's got a real sense of unsettledness to it, as we will hear. And then we go back after that to our original primary material. And that's when we have the recapitulation. I'm not going to be playing too much of this because you've already kind of heard it, a lot of it, but maybe just a little bit of comparison. What we have now is the same as we heard at the very beginning, but everything is just a little bit more decorated. The texture is different, and also there's a point where Mozart, for reasons only known to himself, decides to add some extra bars compared with what we had before. And I'm just going to give you an example of how he does this. This is example 5 now, could you play, this is from the earlier part of the movement, the exposition that we've already heard, bars 13 to 18, the end of our primary theme. And then once they've played that, I'll get them to play the equivalent passage in the recapitulation, which you will hear has been expanded. So 13 to 18 first of all. Okay, so that's what we've already heard at the start of the piece. Now, in this latter part of the piece, this is how Mozart deals with the same passage. And he just manages to find ways of extending it and expanding it. Okay, thank you very much. And you could probably hear there that it was longer, that the music seemed to be going different directions. And also, when Adrian started playing, instead of having a whole bar to himself, Andrea joins him on viola as well. So there's just a little bit more, what we'd call textural density going on here. There's more activity that is happening. So Mozart is expanding here. Even the transition section, when we get to it, has got an extra bar as well, which keeps us in the same key, and then the secondary theme before, as pretty much as before. But we also then have a coda to finish off with. We've got to the end of our secondary theme, but Mozart then decides to reinforce the sense of where we've got to. And what we have actually is nothing much more than a very elaborate chord sequence, but it reinforces the home key. And it's again based on this opening arpeggio. And this time the viola gets the arpeggio to start with. The viola is the one instrument that hasn't had the opening arpeggio, the opening do, 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 do. And it's then passed to the cello and then to the violin as well. And this little section is just to reinforce the sense that, musically speaking, we've come home. So if we're going back to the nice image that Amanda had earlier of the teddy bear sitting at home with its cup of tea in front of the fire, this is the equivalent of having shut the front door and locked it, pulled down the shutters, got the fire going, pouring yourself the tea, the sense that you can now fully relax and, dare I say, hibernate. So can we go from 112, please? It's a really serene way of resolving all the angst that we've heard earlier. Okay, so all this sense of expansiveness going throughout the piece. That's all I want to say on it, really. I don't know if we've got time to play it all, because it's. Shall we play it all? I've got a kind of guide of what's going on here, which I can point out as we're getting to it as well.